And then we can see the transverse processes sticking out on the sides of each one. So each vertebra will have two transverse processes. The spinous process is going to be coming right out of the page here. And so if we were to consider the vertebra as looking like an animal, like a giraffe or a moose or whatever animal you want it to be, the face of it is what is going to be the lamina. So I'm going to draw this on a different vertebra, but this flat piece of bone going from the spinous process to the transverse process on each side, that is going to be the lamina. So we'll draw it on both sides here. That is all going to be the lamina right here on each side. So there's a lamina on each side of the vertebra. So it's just this flattened bone between the transverse process and the spinous process. We can also see sticking out of the bottoms the inferior articulating process, which is the whole bump, and then the inferior articulating facet would be on the other side. So that's what we can see right here. So that would be on the other side of this picture right there, just like so. So we'll highlight that with a yellow color. That is going to be the inferior articulating facet. And we can also see the structures when these vertebrae come together. And so when they come together, our intervertebral disc, this is that fibrocartilage that acts as a shock absorber between the two vertebrae, specifically their vertebral bodies. And then we can also see the difference between this foramen. We'll go back and look at the other one from the other view. But the intervertebral foramen is this hole that's naturally created when two vertebrae come together. So there's one, and here's another one right there. But that is called the intervertebral foramen right here. And so the disc will highlight the different color. We'll highlight the disc in green here. So these are the discs that you find between each vertebra. Intervertebral disc and intervertebral foramen are just the holes that are created between them. So if we go back one page, we'll take a look at just the vertebral foramen, which is going to be this hole right here that the spinal cord goes through. That is the vertebral foramen. Whereas the intervertebral foramen is what's created when two of them come together. Now, working on cervical vertebra, this will be our first region of the vertebral column. These two structures right here, if you find them on a vertebra, you immediately know it's a cervical vertebra because only these two structures are found on cervical vertebrae. And the first one is the transverse foramen, which is going to be a hole that goes between or pierces through each transverse process called transverse foramen. And so in Unit 3, we'll talk about a artery called vertebral artery that actually runs between these holes of the cervical vertebra called the transverse foramen. So this is only found in the cervical region. So if you find one of these, a hole going through the transverse process, you know it's a cervical vertebra. There's also something called the Bifid spinous process. And so the spinous process on cervical vertebra actually split in two or bifurcate, which is where that bifid comes from, and splits in two rather than just being a single solid piece of bone. So as we take a look, here is that bifid spinous process. So you notice it splits into two parts here rather than just being a single point. And then we also have the transverse foramen right here, one on each side, going through the transverse process. So if you see either of these structures, you know you're dealing with a cervical vertebra. Now working on specific cervical vertebra, these are this vertebra and the next one are the only ones you have to know specifically, and it's because they're special. They'll look a lot different than the rest of them. And the first one's called atlas, and so this is the first cervical vertebra, and it looks almost like a ring. And so you can see this is pretty clear what kind of vertebra this is due to the transverse foramen, but this is the first one that actually the skull is going to sit on, and it has a distinct appearance.